You might want to pause for a second and really take this in, because what is approaching is not subtle. It is not gentle. And it is definitely not something you can simply brush off and move past like you have done so many times before. Because in just 2 days, something rare begins to unfold, something that does not happen often, something that has a way of reaching directly into the parts of you that you have carefully avoided confronting. And this is not about the version of you that you show the world. This is about the version of you that even you hesitate to fully face, because on Friday, May 1st, at exactly 1:20 in the afternoon, the full moon reaches its peak in Scorpio. And this moment carries a kind of intensity that goes far beyond what people typically associate with a lunar phase. It is not just light in the sky, it is illumination in the deepest sense. Like every hidden corner of a dark room suddenly being exposed all at once, and the space you thought was safe, the space where you believed you could remain unseen, becomes impossible to hide in. Because Scorpio energy does not allow illusion to survive, it strips away what is false, it dissolves what is performative, and it brings you face to face with what has always been there beneath the surface. Whether you are ready or not, and this moment becomes a threshold, a dividing line that marks a before and after, and you do not get to stand still at that line. You either step across it consciously, or you are pulled across it by the force of what is being revealed, because Scorpio does not negotiate. It does not soften the truth to make it easier to accept. It simply presents it in its raw form and waits for you to respond. And what makes this even more complex, even more powerful, in a way that most people completely overlook, is that this full moon is occurring at the furthest distance from Earth, what astronomers refer to as a micromoon. And while most attention tends to go toward the larger, more visually dramatic supermoons, this quieter, more distant moon is doing something far more internal, far more psychological. It is drawing the emotional current inward, pulling everything you have buried deeper into your awareness, into your subconscious, into the place where you can no longer pretend it does not exist. And if you have been noticing a pressure building inside you, something subtle but persistent, something that feels like it is trying to rise but keeps getting pushed back down, that is not coincidence, that is not random, that is a signal, and there is a very specific reason why this is happening now, to you, in this moment. And you are going to understand that reason as we move forward. But before that, you need to recognize how critical the next 72 hours are, because once this peak passes, there is no returning to the previous version of yourself, the one who could maintain appearances, the one who could convince themselves that everything was under control. That version reaches its expiration on May 1st. And what emerges after is something different, something more aware, more honest, more exposed. And that is where the symbolism becomes even more revealing. Because this time of year is traditionally associated with what is called the flower moon, a name that sounds soft, almost comforting, tied to the blooming of spring and the idea of abundance and beauty. But when this same energy moves through Scorpio, the blooming does not happen where people expect it to. It does not happen in clear light or open air. It happens underground, in the unseen places, in the breakdown, in the decay, in the parts of life that are usually hidden from view. And that is the paradox you are living through right now, because real transformation does not occur in comfort. It does not emerge from perfection. It develops in the places where things fall apart, where identities shift, where illusions collapse. And Scorpio, more than any other sign, understands this cycle intimately. It understands that something must end in order for something else to begin. And if you think about something like a lotus flower, it does not grow in pristine conditions. It grows in murky water, rooted in mud, surrounded by what most people would consider undesirable. And yet that very environment is what allows it to become something extraordinary. And that is exactly what is happening within you. Now you are being brought into direct awareness of the parts of your life that feel messy, unresolved, uncomfortable, the emotional residue you have been avoiding, the patterns you've been covering with distractions or surface-level positivity, the situations that look stable from the outside but feel like they are slowly deteriorating underneath. All of it is rising, not to overwhelm you, but to be seen clearly for the first time. And the part that most people misunderstand is that this exposure is not a form of punishment. It is preparation, because growth cannot take place when the foundation is unstable. When the roots are entangled in what is no longer supportive, something has to be released. Something has to be allowed to break down, and often it is the very thing you have been trying the hardest to preserve. And even if your mind has been resisting this realization, your body has already been responding. Your body has been aware of this shift long before your thoughts caught up. And if you take a moment to check in with yourself, you may notice it, that lingering heaviness in your chest that does not fully go away, the tightening in your stomach when certain thoughts come up, the kind of fatigue that does not improve with rest, because it is not physical exhaustion. It is emotional weight. It is the strain of holding on to something that no longer fits, and as this full moon approaches, those signals intensify. They become harder to ignore. You might feel tension building in your head, your jaw tightening without realizing it, your breath becoming shallow as if your body is bracing for something, and none of this is random. None of this is without meaning. It is your physical system communicating what your conscious awareness has not yet fully accepted. And as this continues to unfold, the question becomes not whether something is being revealed, but whether you are willing to truly see it when it does. There is something you need to understand before anything else, and it may feel uncomfortable to hear, but it is the key to everything that is unfolding right now, because when truth is pushed down, when it is ignored, avoided, or deliberately silenced, it does not dissolve or fade away. It does not lose its power. Instead, it relocates. It sinks beneath your awareness and embeds itself into your body, into your nervous system, into the tension in your muscles, into the subtle signals your body has been sending you that you keep trying to rationalize or dismiss. And over time, it builds pressure, quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, but persistent, until it reaches a point where it can no longer remain contained. And that is exactly where this Scorpio full moon comes in, because this moment acts like a release point, like a valve being opened. After too much pressure has been stored for too long, and everything you have been holding inside, every suppressed emotion, every unspoken truth, every hidden realization begins to rise all at once, not gently, not gradually, but with intensity. And this is where your experience can diverge dramatically depending on how you meet it, because some people will resist this surge. They will try to hold it back to maintain control. And that resistance often manifests physically or emotionally, showing up as sudden illness, overwhelming fatigue, emotional collapse, moments where everything feels like too much, while others, the ones who recognize what is actually happening beneath the surface, will choose to work with this energy instead of fighting it. And for them, this becomes something entirely different. It becomes a powerful form of release, a deep cleansing that moves through not just the body, but the mind, and the deeper layers of identity. And what is important to realize is that what is rising is not here to harm you. It is not here to destabilize you without purpose. It is here to remove what has been weighing you down, to liberate you from what you have been carrying for far too long. And as this process unfolds, the symbolism tied to this particular full moon adds another layer that is almost impossible to ignore, because the exact point where this moon reaches its peak is associated with what is known as the Sabian symbol, and the image connected to it is that of an embassy ball. And if you really let yourself picture that scene, a grand room filled with elegantly dressed individuals, every movement refined, every interaction carefully controlled, polite smiles exchanged, conversations that sound pleasant but carry deeper meanings underneath everything, appears composed, civilized, almost perfect on the surface. But beneath that surface there is tension. There are unspoken rivalries. There are competing agendas. There is strategy in every word, every glance, every gesture, because nothing in that environment is entirely authentic. Everything is curated. Everything is part of a performance. And if you are honest with yourself, you can probably see where this mirrors your own life right now. Because there is likely an area where you have been maintaining appearances, where you have been following an unspoken script, keeping things smooth on the surface, while something deeper remains unresolved. Whether that shows up in a relationship where both people avoid the real conversation while resentment quietly builds, or in a professional environment where you continue to play along even though you are aware that something about the structure is fundamentally misaligned, or even in friendships where everything stays light and pleasant but never reaches a level of real honesty. You have been participating in this dynamic. You have been keeping the peace, maintaining the image, and if you are paying attention, you are probably also feeling how exhausting that has become, because performing stability while suppressing truth requires a constant output of energy, and this is where the shift becomes undeniable. Because this Scorpio full moon does not support that kind of sustained illusion, it disrupts it. It introduces a moment where the carefully maintained structure can no longer hold, like someone stepping into that controlled environment and suddenly overturning the table that everything was built around. And in that moment, the roles begin to crack. The masks lose their integrity, and what has been hidden becomes visible, not gradually, but all at once. And the intensity of that exposure is what makes this energy feel so powerful, because it is not subtle. It is not something you can gently redirect. It demands acknowledgement. And that leads to the question that sits quietly beneath everything you have been feeling. What in your life is no longer sustainable in its current form? What have you been holding together that is already beginning to fall apart beneath the surface? Because whether you consciously admit it or not, there is something, and you already have an intuitive sense of what it is. And that sense, that pressure you have been noticing, especially in your body, is directly connected to it. Because at the center of all of this, there is something you have been keeping contained. Something you have not fully allowed into the open, and that containment has been creating tension, not just mentally, but physically. And under this Scorpio full moon, that containment becomes impossible to maintain. Because this energy has a way of bringing what is hidden into full awareness, not on your preferred timeline, not when it feels convenient, but when it reaches a point where it must be addressed. And for some, this may involve truths within relationships, things that have been avoided out of fear of what might happen if they are spoken for others. It may be something more internal, unresolved experiences, emotions that were never fully processed, parts of yourself that were set aside because they did not fit the version of who you thought you needed to be. And for others, still, it may connect to your external life, the roles you have been playing, the image you have been maintaining, situations where what appears stable on the outside does not reflect what is actually happening beneath. And regardless of the form it takes, what is important is not the specific content of what is revealed, but the function of that revelation. Because it is not about judgment, it is not about punishment, it is about release. It is about removing the constant strain of holding something in place that no longer belongs there. And if you really consider it, you can begin to understand just how much energy has been required to maintain that concealment. How much of your focus, your emotional capacity, your physical state has been tied up in keeping something from being fully seen. And as this realization deepens, the next step becomes unavoidable. Because once you recognize the cost of that effort, the question is no longer whether something will change, but how you are going to meet that change when it arrives. At some point, you have to admit how exhausting it has become. The constant calculation, the subtle tension that follows you into every interaction. Because when you are carrying something unspoken, something unresolved, something you are actively trying to keep hidden. Every conversation stops being natural and starts becoming strategic. Every word has to be filtered, every reaction carefully measured, and instead of being present, you are split. One part of you engaging while another part is constantly scanning, adjusting, making sure nothing slips through. And that state of hyper-awareness slowly erodes your sense of ease until even silence feels heavy, because you are never truly at rest. And this is exactly the state that the Scorpio full moon refuses to sustain any longer. It interrupts that pattern with a force that does not ask for permission. It simply declares that the weight you have been carrying has reached its limit, and whether you decide to release it intentionally or whether it breaks through on its own, the outcome is the same. What has been contained will no longer remain contained, and this is where the difference in this particular full moon becomes essential to understand, because you might look back and think you have experienced similar moments before. You have seen emotional peaks, you have gone through cycles of intensity, but this one operates on a completely different level because it is not about visible reactions or dramatic external events. It is about depth. It is about what is happening beneath the surface, where most people rarely look. And the reason for that lies in the nature of this, being a micro-moon occurring at the moon's greatest distance from Earth, which shifts the entire dynamic of how the energy expresses itself. Because instead of amplifying outward reactions like a supermoon would, instead of creating obvious waves that everyone can see and respond to, this configuration pulls everything inward. It creates a kind of internal current, an undertow that moves below awareness at first, but gradually becomes impossible to ignore. And this is why what you have been feeling lately may not have a clear source. Why there is a sense of something being off, without a specific event to point to. Why the intensity seems to be building inside you rather than erupting around you. Because you are being drawn into layers of yourself that you have not fully explored before. And unlike more externalized energy that allows for release through visible expression, this requires something else entirely. It requires you to turn inward, to examine, to uncover, to sit with what emerges without immediately trying to escape it. And that process is not always comfortable. In fact, it rarely is, because what exists in those deeper layers is often what has been avoided for a reason. And yet, this is where the real shift begins, not in the dramatic moment of exposure, but in the sustained process that follows. Because 5 days after this full moon reaches its peak on May 6th, Pluto, the planetary force most closely aligned with Scorpio's themes of transformation and psychological depth, shifts direction and begins its retrograde motion. And this is where the experience extends far beyond a single day or even a single week, because what is initiated at the moment of exposure becomes a longer journey, one that unfolds over approximately 5 months, carrying you through a period of internal reconstruction that continues until October. And this is not a surface-level adjustment. This is a process that reaches into the foundational aspects of who you are, how you think, how you respond, how you define yourself, and gradually reshapes those elements from the inside out. And while many people may not recognize the significance of this shift as it begins, you will feel it. You will notice the way your awareness changes, the way certain patterns become impossible to ignore, the way old responses no longer feel viable, and at the same time as this, deeper transformation is set into motion. There is another alignment occurring that directly impacts how you express what you are experiencing. Because on the same day as the full moon Mercury, the planet associated with communication and articulation forms an exact conjunction with Chiron, a point that represents deep personal wounds and the process of healing through awareness. And this alignment takes place in Aries, a sign connected to identity assertion and the fundamental right to exist and express oneself, which means that what is being activated here is not just your awareness of what has been suppressed, but your capacity to finally give it a voice. And this is where the experience becomes particularly intense. Because speaking from that place is not easy. It requires confronting the very fears that led to silence in the first place. The fear of rejection, the fear of conflict, the fear of being misunderstood or dismissed. And if you reflect on your own experiences, you may recognize how often you have chosen silence as a way to maintain stability. How many times you have held back your words to avoid disrupting the dynamic around you. How often you have allowed others to define the narrative because asserting your own felt too risky. And what changes now is not that those fears disappear, but that the cost of remaining silent becomes more significant than the risk of speaking. And this shift creates a moment where expression is no longer optional. It becomes necessary. Because the pressure that has been building internally reaches a point where it must be released, and when it is, it tends to carry a level of precision and impact that is difficult to ignore. Because it is rooted in accumulated truth rather than momentary reaction. And that is why what is said during this time often feels definitive, like something that cannot be retracted once it has been spoken. And while that may bring consequences, it is important to recognize that maintaining silence also carries its own consequences, ones that accumulate over time, gradually limiting your ability to be authentic, gradually turning your internal world into a confined space where certain aspects of yourself are no longer allowed to exist freely. And eventually, that confinement becomes unsustainable. Which is why this moment can be seen not just as a disruption, but as an opening, a point where the possibility of change becomes tangible, and even within all of this intensity, there is a stabilizing influence present, something that provides structure and support as everything else shifts, because shortly after the full moon reaches its peak, approximately 90 minutes later, Venus in Gemini forms a harmonious connection with Saturn in Aries. And this alignment introduces a different quality into the experience, one that offers grounding, one that allows for clarity and intentional action rather than complete overwhelm. And as you move forward from this point, understanding how to work with both the intensity and the stability available to you will shape how this entire process unfolds. There is a moment in the middle of all this intensity that you might miss if you are only focused on what is breaking apart, and that moment is where your stability actually lives. Because while everything else seems to be unraveling, there is a quieter force stepping in, one that does not shout or demand attention, but instead offers structure, clarity, and direction. And that force comes through the connection between Venus and Saturn, where Venus represents what you value, how you relate, how you define your worth. And Saturn represents the reality you cannot escape, the discipline you must embody, the structure that holds everything together when emotions threaten to scatter you. And when these two energies align in harmony, they create something incredibly rare, the ability to stay grounded even as everything around you shifts, the ability to respond instead of react, the ability to move through chaos without losing your center. And this is what allows you to navigate the exposure, the truth, telling the collapse of what was never stable to begin with, without completely losing yourself in the process, because this alignment functions like that one person who steps into a crisis, not with panic, but with a clear plan. Someone who looks at what has fallen apart and immediately begins to rebuild with intention. And that energy exists within you right now if you choose to access it. It is the part of you that understands that not everything is meant to be saved, that some connections have reached their natural conclusion, that some truths cannot remain unspoken any longer. And that growth often requires decisions that are uncomfortable but necessary. And if you lean into this consciously, if you allow yourself to engage with what is being revealed instead of resisting it, this energy will support you with exactly what you need. It will help you define your boundaries. Clearly, it will help you see situations for what they actually are instead of what you hoped they could be. And it will give you the discipline to act in alignment with truth rather than temporary comfort. And this is how you move through the Scorpio full moon without becoming overwhelmed. You allow what needs to surface. You speak what needs to be spoken. But you do it with steadiness, with awareness, with a sense of responsibility to both yourself and others. You do not need to become harsh in order to be honest. You do not need to destroy everything in order to create change. There is a way to hold both strength and compassion at the same time, to be direct without being destructive, to be truthful without abandoning care. And that balance is your anchor. It is available to you, but you have to actively choose it. And as this energy unfolds, it becomes clear that while everyone will feel the intensity of this full moon, not everyone will know how to use it because there are certain archetypal patterns, certain placements that are positioned to take this pressure and convert it into something tangible, something that leads to real shifts rather than just temporary disruption. And among those, Scorpio stands at the center of this transformation, because if you have Scorpio as your sun moon or rising, this full moon is not happening around you, it is happening through you. It is activating your first house, the space that defines who you are at your core, how you see yourself, how you present yourself, how you exist in the world, and that means everything that has been hidden, avoided, or controlled is now moving into full awareness. And if you are honest that loss of control is one of the most uncomfortable experiences for you, because control has been your way of maintaining stability, your way of protecting yourself from vulnerability. But what this moment is showing you is that what you thought was protection has also been a limitation. The identity you have been preserving, the defenses you have built, the distance you have maintained, they are not as necessary as you believed. And as they begin to fall away, what is revealed is not weakness, but something far more powerful, something more authentic, more direct, more alive than the version you have been managing. And yes, being seen at that level can feel unsettling, but it also opens a kind of freedom that cannot exist when you are constantly guarding yourself. And this process does not stop at the surface level, because just 5 days later, as Pluto begins its retrograde motion in your fourth house, the transformation moves deeper into your emotional foundation, your sense of home, your early conditioning, the patterns that have shaped how you respond to the world. And over the next 5 months, these areas will be restructured in ways that may not always be comfortable, but will ultimately bring you into alignment with something more stable and more true. And your role in this is not to control the outcome, but to allow the process to release what is no longer aligned, to stop holding on to versions of yourself that no longer fit, and to let yourself be seen in your complexity without trying to simplify or hide it. And when you do that, you move through this transformation not as someone being broken down, but as someone being rebuilt in a way that reflects who you actually are. And at the same time, for Taurus, this energy plays out in a different but equally significant area because this full moon activates your 7th house, the space that governs partnerships, commitments, the agreements you form with others. And if there is one thing you tend to prioritize, it is stability, consistency, the sense that things are secure and reliable. But what this energy reveals is whether that stability is real or whether it has been maintained through avoidance, because Scorpio does not allow relationships to continue on the basis of surface-level harmony if deeper issues are present. And what happens now is that everything that has been unspoken begins to surface, the dynamics of power within the relationship, the financial entanglements that may not have been fully addressed, the emotional undercurrents that have been ignored, the small resentments that have accumulated over time. All of it comes into the open. And this creates a moment of truth, a point where the relationship either deepens through honesty or reveals itself as something that cannot continue in its current form. And while that may feel destabilizing, it also offers clarity. Because what survives this process is not built on illusion. It is built on reality, on mutual understanding, on a willingness to engage with what is actually there, rather than what is convenient to maintain. And as this continues to unfold, the direction it takes will depend on how willing you are to face what is being revealed and respond with both honesty and intention. There is a moment most people overlook because they are too focused on what is breaking instead of what is being rebuilt. And that moment is where everything begins to shift in your favor. Because when a connection survives this level of truth, when it moves through exposure instead of avoiding it, it does not return to something fragile or surface level. It becomes something deeper, something rooted in honesty rather than performance. And that kind of bond carries a different weight, a different kind of strength, because it is no longer dependent on illusion. It is built on what is real, and for those of you who are not currently attached. This same energy can draw in a connection that feels intense, almost destabilizing in how quickly it shifts your perspective. Not because it is unsafe, but because it challenges you to grow beyond the version of yourself that has been clinging to comfort. And this is where your role becomes clear. You are not here to hold everything in place. You are here to allow movement, to let connections evolve into something deeper, or dissolve if they cannot hold truth, because stability without honesty is not stability at all, and as this realization settles in, another layer begins to open, particularly for Leo, where the focus turns away from the external world and into the internal structure that has been quietly shaping everything. Because this full moon activates your fourth house, the part of your life that holds your roots, your private emotional landscape, your sense of safety. And what begins to happen now is that something from that space rises into awareness, something that may have been buried for a long time. Whether it is a family dynamic that has gone unquestioned, an emotional imprint from earlier experiences, or even the recognition that what you have built your sense of security on is not as solid as you once believed. And this can feel deeply uncomfortable because you are used to operating in spaces where you can be seen, where your energy moves outward. But this moment pulls you inward into the parts of yourself that are not visible, into the foundation that everything else depends on. And while that process may not feel rewarding in the moment, it is where real stability is created. Because by addressing what is at the root, by understanding and restructuring what has been holding your emotional world together, you create the ability to build something that can actually support your growth, moving forward and at the same time. As Pluto begins its retrograde through your seventh house, your relationships are also shifting. Meaning that as you rebuild your inner world, your external connections are being redefined in alignment with that new foundation. And although that may feel overwhelming, it is part of a necessary process that brings coherence between who you are internally and how you relate externally. And as this energy continues, it moves into Aquarius, where the focus shifts toward your career, your public role, and the way you are recognized in the world, because this full moon activates your 10th house and with Pluto retrograding in your first house. The transformation is happening both in your identity and in how you express that identity professionally, and what this creates is a moment where something within your career path becomes impossible to ignore. Whether it is a misalignment with your deeper purpose, a dynamic within your professional environment that no longer feels acceptable, or a realization that the structure you have been operating within is limiting your ability to fully express your potential. And whatever form it takes, it leads to a point where continuing as you have been is no longer sustainable, because the version of you that was willing to compromise is beginning to dissolve. And what replaces it is a stronger sense of individuality, a clearer understanding of your own value, and a greater willingness to pursue paths that reflect your authentic direction. And while that may require letting go of roles or identities that once felt secure, it also opens the door to a level of professional evolution that aligns with who you actually are. And from there, the focus moves into Aries, where this full moon activates your 8th house. The space connected to transformation, shared resources, and the dynamics of power within intimate relationships and with Saturn, Mercury, and Chiron, all moving through your sign. There is a strong momentum pushing you forward, a combination of pressure and clarity that makes avoidance impossible. And for you, the truths that surface during this time often relate to where power has been exchanged, whether that involves financial dependency, emotional attachment, or patterns where you have given more than you have received. And what this moment does is bring those dynamics into full awareness. And with Mercury aligning with Chiron, you are given the ability to express what has been difficult to articulate, to bring language to experiences that have been held internally. And that expression becomes the first step in reclaiming your autonomy, your resources, your sense of authority. And while that process may involve difficult realizations, it ultimately leads to a form of independence that is not about isolation, but about choosing connections from a place of wholeness rather than need. And as all of this unfolds, it becomes clear that the initial exposure is only the beginning, because once the truth surfaces, the real work begins. And this is where the timeline expands beyond a single moment. Because after May 1st, when everything comes into the open the following days, begin a process of integration with Pluto's retrograde on May 6th, initiating a deeper restructuring that unfolds over months, allowing you to process what has been revealed and rebuild your internal world with greater awareness. And as Mercury moves into Taurus on May 2nd, your thinking begins to stabilize, giving you the ability to make sense of what has happened in a grounded and practical way. While the alignment of Mars and Jupiter on May 4th introduces a surge of energy that can either be directed toward constructive action or allowed to scatter into impulsive reactions. And then, by May 16th, when the new moon in Taurus arrives, you are given the opportunity to begin again, to plant something new in the space that has been cleared. And this sequence follows a pattern that is both intense and purposeful, where what is broken down is processed, what is exposed is integrated, and what ends creates the conditions for something new to emerge. And this is not a quick shift or a temporary phase. It is a sustained initiation that reshapes how you move through your life. And as you stand here now before everything fully unfolds, you are faced with a choice that will determine how this experience plays out for you. Because you can resist what is coming. You can continue to suppress what is rising. You can maintain the appearance of stability for a little while longer, or you can choose to engage with this energy consciously, to release what needs to be released, to express what needs to be expressed, to allow the transformation to occur with your participation rather than against your will. And the reality is that the process itself will happen regardless. The truth will surface, the structures that are not aligned will begin to shift, and the only difference lies in whether you move with it or are forced by it, because conscious transformation, while still challenging, allows you to direct your experience, to make choices, to respond intentionally, while unconscious transformation removes that agency, allowing circumstances to dictate the outcome. And this is why this moment matters. Because it is not just about what is being revealed, it is about how you choose to meet it, whether you take hold of the process and move through it with awareness, or whether you allow it to unfold around you without your input. And as everything begins to shift, what waits on the other side is not just change, but a level of clarity, freedom, and alignment that cannot be reached without first moving through this phase. And that is the true nature of what is unfolding now. Not destruction for its own sake, but transformation that leads to something stronger, something more real, something that reflects who you actually are when nothing false remains.